The humidity in the Philippines is a physical weight. It sits on your chest like a wet wool blanket, pressing down until every breath feels like you're drowning in slow motion. My tactical vest, usually a comfort, felt like a corset made of lead. I checked my GPS for the 10th time in an hour. No signal. Just static and the mocking blink of a low battery warning. I was miles off the designated extraction grid, deep in the canopy of Mindanao, running from a world that had caught fire 3 weeks ago. They called it a containment breach back in the States. The news anchors, their faces pale with a terror they couldn't script, mumbled about civil unrest and biological anomalies. We knew better. Those of us in the circle, the ones who had whispered about Protocol Black in the mess halls of Bragg and Benning, we knew exactly what was happening. SHTF wasn't a theory anymore. It was the new atmospheric condition. And here I was, halfway across the world, looking for a ghost. The intel I had stolen from the blackened server room in Guam pointed here. Not to a modern safe house, but to something older. Something forgotten. The jungle had reclaimed the road decades ago, leaving only the faintest scar and the undergrowth to follow. Vines thick as a man's legs strangled the mahogany trees. Every shadow looked like one of them, the infected. Even here, thousands of miles from the epicenter in the Midwest, paranoia was my only companion. I pushed through a wall of ferns, my machete dulling with every swing. Then I saw it. It didn't look like a building, it looked like a tombstone. A massive slab of concrete jutting out of the mountainside, swallowed by moss and time. I froze, dropping to a knee, my rifle raised. Silence. Not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of a predator holding its breath. I crept forward, boots squelching in the mud. As I got closer, the shapes resolved. It wasn't just a slab. It was a blast door. Rusted, pitted, but unmistakably industrial. And there, faintly etched into the stone above the frame, barely visible beneath 50 years of grime, was the chrysanthemum seal. The Imperial Japanese Navy. This wasn't just a bunker. It was a relic of the Pacific War. But the intel said this place was active. Not in 1945. Now. The heavy steel wheel of the door was fused with rust, but the smaller personnel hatch next to it had been cut open with a thermal lance. Recently. The edges of the metal were still jagged, free of oxidation. I switched on my weapon light, the beam cutting a cone through the gloom. The air that drifted out smelled of ozone, stagnant water, and something coppery. Blood. Check your corners, I whispered to myself, a mantra from a life that no longer existed. I stepped inside. The transition was instant. The oppressive heat of the jungle vanished, replaced by a damp, subterranean chill. The walls were lined with rotting cables and pipes that sweated condensation. My boots echoed on the concrete floor. This main corridor was wide enough to drive a truck through, or a torpedo. To my left, rusted racks stood empty, ghost limbs of a war machine long dead. But as I moved deeper, the anomalies started. I kicked something across the floor. It clattered loudly, freezing me in place for a solid minute. I shone my light down. It wasn't a spent shell casing from an Arisaka rifle. It was a wrapper. Mari. Menu 14, spicy penne pasta. The packaging was fresh. American issue. My heart hammered against my ribs. Protocol Black wasn't just a domestic failure, it was a global network. I moved faster now, the dread mixing with adrenaline. The layout was confused, classic Japanese tunnel defense, turning back on itself, dead ends designed to trap invaders. But someone had run new power lines along the ceiling. Yellow industrial cables zip-tied to the rusting conduits. I found a heavy bulkhead door slightly ajar. A sign in Japanese warned of high voltage, but a piece of duct tape slapped over it read Lab 4 in black Sharpie. I pushed the door open with the barrel of my rifle. The room inside was a collision of eras. Old wooden desks rotted in the corner, but the center of the room was dominated by stainless steel cleanroom tables. Microscopes, centrifuges, laptops covered in dust. And the smell. That copper tang was overpowering here. I approached the main desk. Papers were scattered everywhere, frantic scrawls of mathematics and biology. I picked up a file folder. It was stamped top secret, but the logo wasn't the DoD. It was the stylized helix of the shadowy contractor group we'd been warned about. Inside, photos clipped to pages of Japanese text. Black and white photos from the 1940s showing soldiers with black veins, feral eyes. Next to them, high-res color photos from 3 weeks ago. The same symptoms. My God! I muttered. They didn't create it. They found it. Protocol Black wasn't about developing a weapon. It was about excavating one. The Japanese had found something in this jungle 80 years ago, something that turned men into monsters, and they had buried it. We, in our arrogance, had dug it back up. A sound echoed from the corridor behind me. A wet, dragging scrape. Then a low, guttural click. I spun around, raising my rifle. The beam of my light trembled. The tunnel I had just walked through was no longer empty. At the edge of the darkness, 20 yards back, a silhouette stood. It wore the tattered remains of a modern tactical vest, similar to mine, but its posture was wrong. Broken. It twitched, the head snapping to the side at an impossible angle. It let out a hiss that sounded like escaping steam. Then, from the darkness behind it, another pair of eyes reflected the light. Then another. I racked the charging handle. I was miles from help, buried in a tomb of history's worst mistakes, and the residents were waking up. The SHTF scenario wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about containment. And I was on the wrong side of the door. The humidity in the tunnel was oppressive, a physical weight that pressed against my lungs with every breath. It didn't smell like the jungle anymore. That rich, rotting scent of vegetation and wet earth was gone, replaced by the sterile, metallic tang of galvanized steel and ancient, undisturbed dust. My tactical shirt was already soaked through, the fabric clinging to my back like a second skin. I adjusted the strap of my chest rig, feeling the comforting weight of the few spare magazines I had left, and pressed my back against the cold, sweating concrete of the main arterial tunnel. In my left hand, the waterproof canister I'd pulled from the skeletal grip of the base commander felt heavier than its physical mass warranted. The documents inside were brittle, the paper yellow to the color of old bone, but the red ink stamp remained violently clear, Kurwakiaku. Protocol black. I didn't speak fluent Japanese, but I knew enough military history to recognize the classification codes used by the Imperial Navy. This wasn't just a naval supply depot or a submarine refuel point. This was a containment site. A Level 5 biological or technological black site that had terrified the Imperial High Command enough to bury it alive rather than evacuate it in 1945. A sound from the tunnel entrance, perhaps 200 meters back the way I came, froze the blood in my veins. It wasn't the chattering of the macaques or the distant, electric drone of the cicadas. It was the distinct, rhythmic crunch of heavy vibram soles on loose gravel. Then, the high-pitched electronic whine of night vision goggles powering up. I checked my watch, 1,400 hours. Outside, the Philippine sun was blazing. But inside the mountain, it was a void. I lowered my PVS-14 monocular over my left eye. The world erupted into grainy green phosphor. The crumbling walls were illuminated in spectral detail, lined with heavy industrial cabling, thick as a python, running deeper into the earth. The floor was littered with debris, crates, fallen ventilation ducts, and the occasional rusted helmet. Check corners. Eliminate on sight. A voice echoed down the corridor. It was distorted by a radio and the acoustic reverberation of the tunnel, but the English was accented. American? No. It had the clipped, hard cadence of a South African mercenary or perhaps Slavic pretending to be Western. The acoustics of the tunnel carried the sound perfectly. They weren't hiding their presence. They knew I was here. They were hurting me. I had a SIG P320 with a threaded barrel and a meager 2 spare mags. Against a squad? That was suicide. My only advantage was the terrain. I knew the layout of the first level because I had just walked it. They were likely reading it off a satellite scan or a stolen map. I moved. Quiet steps, rolling heel to toe to absorb the impact and minimize the sound's signature. I needed to break the line of sight before they established a base of fire. I ducked into a side chamber labeled communications in faded kanji. It was a dead end, filled with rotted radio equipment and overturned tables, but it offered hard cover. I pressed into the shadows behind a rusted server rack, controlling my breathing. In, hold out. Through the jagged doorway, I watched the heat signatures on my thermal imager, a small handheld FLIR unit I kept in my admin pouch. 3 figures. Tight formation. Plate carriers, high-cut ballistic helmets with strobes on the back, suppressed carbines. Likely HK-416S or similar short-stroke piston platforms. The lead man raised a fist. They stopped instantly. The point man scanned the floor, his IR laser sweeping the dust. He was looking for footprints. My footprints. He signaled. They began to move again, faster now. They had my track. I couldn't stay here. The fatal funnel of the doorway would be my coffin. I slipped out the back of the room through a maintenance hatch I'd noted earlier. It dropped me into a subfloor crawlspace, a cable run designed for maintenance access. It was tight, claustrophobic, and smelled of dead rats and stagnant water. I crawled on my elbows, the rough concrete scraping my skin raw, dragging my pack behind me. Above me, heavy boots thudded against the floor plates. Dust rained down into my eyes, stinging and blinding. I followed the cable run for 50 meters until the space widened into a vertical shaft. A rusty iron ladder descended into the abyss. The air drafting up from below was freezing cold, unnaturally so for the tropical climate. It smelled of ozone and formaldehyde. I took the ladder, one rung at a time, testing the integrity of the metal before committing my weight. The metal groaned, a sound that seemed deafening in the silence. I counted the floors as I passed them. Level 2, barracks. Level 3, armory. Level 4. The label plate was too corroded to read, but the heavy blast door was sealed shut with welding marks. I reached the bottom landing. Level 5. The air here was sterile. The layout was different, no more utilitarian military concrete. The walls were tiled in white ceramic, now cracked and stained brown with oxidation. I moved down the hallway, weapon drawn, checking my 6 every few seconds. To my left, a viewing window looked into a large circular room. I wiped the condensation off the glass with my sleeve. My breath caught. It wasn't a room. It was a silo. In the center, suspended by heavy chains that looked like they were forged yesterday, hung a sphere of dull black metal, roughly 3 meters in diameter. It was hooked up to machinery that looked decades ahead of 1945 technology. Thick pipes ran from the sphere into the floor, pulsating with a faint, rhythmic vibration. I pulled the dossier out again, squinting in the low light of my red filter flashlight to preserve my natural night vision. I flipped to the page with the diagram of the sphere. The translation notes in the margins, scribbled by some long-dead OSS agent who had apparently intercepted this intel but never acted on it, read: Asterisk. Acoustic resonance weapon? Biological dispersal? Note: subject produces infrasound capable of inducing hemorrhaging. Asterisk. Subject. Not object. A sudden vibration shook the floor. Not an explosion. A pulse. It came from the sphere. My vision blurred for a second. A sharp pain spiked behind my eyes, like a migraine onset but instantaneous. I grabbed the window frame to steady myself. The sphere was humming. It was active. Contact front! The shout came from the end of the hallway. A blinding white light, roughly 1,000 lumens, cut through the darkness, washing out my NVGs. I ripped the monocular off my face, dropping to a knee, and fired 2 rounds blindly toward the light. The report of the 9mm was deafening in the confined space. The light scrambled, and I heard the chaotic snap of return fire. Bullets chipped the ceramic tiles around my head, sending razor-sharp shards into my cheek. I sprinted for the nearest door, a heavy steel bulkhead. I slammed the locking wheel and spun it. The gears screamed in protest, ancient grease fighting friction, but the bolts slid home just as a hail of 56mm rounds hammered against the metal from the other side. I was safe, for the moment. But I was trapped. I turned around to see where I was. It was a control room. Banks of analog dials and vacuum tubes lined the walls, But in the center of the room, on a steel table, lay a corpse. It wasn't a skeleton. It was mummified, preserved by the cold, dry air. It wore the uniform of an Imperial Japanese Navy officer. In his hand he held a Nambu pistol. There was a hole in his temple. On the desk in front of him lay a logbook. Open. I holstered my weapon and approached the desk, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The gunfire outside the door had stopped. They were placing charges. I had maybe 2 minutes before they blew the door off its hinges. I shone my light on the logbook. The final entry was written in frantic, jagged strokes. I pulled up my phone, using the translation app I downloaded before the trek. It struggled with the handwriting, but the gist appeared on my screen, glowing eerie blue. Asterisk. Day 40 of containment. The Black Protocol is a failure. It does not sleep. It learns. The crew is hallucinating. Commander Ito tried to open the vents. I had to shoot him. The Americans are not coming. Something else is coming. The sphere calls to them. It calls to the water. We are sealing the lower levels. May the Emperor forgive us for what we woke up. Asterisk. Asterisk thump. Asterisk. The door behind me buckled. A linear-shaped charge. They were cutting the hinges. I looked around frantically for an exit. There was none. Just the observation glass looking down into the silo where the black sphere hung. Wait. The sphere. The dossier said it produced infrasound. It reacted to vibration. The mercenaries were drilling the lock now. The vibration would be traveling through the structure. I looked at the control panel. A series of levers marked with warning stripes. One lever was pulled all the way down, damping field. If I released the damping field, the sphere would wake up fully. The door hinge was glowing cherry red. They were breaching. I looked at the mummified officer. Forgive me, I whispered. I grabbed the lever. It was stuck. I kicked it with the heel of my boot. It slammed upward. The hum from the silo intensified instantly, rising from a subsonic throb to a bone-rattling scream. The glass overlooking the silo cracked. The blast door blew inward with a concussive roar. Smoke and debris filled the room. 2 dark figures stormed in, weapons raised, lasers cutting the dust. Drop it! On the ground! I didn't drop it. I dropped to the floor, hands over my ears, curling into a ball behind the console. The mercenaries froze. One of them staggered, dropping his rifle. He clawed at his helmet, screaming. The infrasound wasn't just noise. It was a physical assault. The frequency resonated with the liquid in the inner ear and the fluid in the eyes. The lead mercenary fell to his knees, vomiting inside his gas mask. I felt it too, a nausea so profound the world spun sideways. But I was further from the emitter, shielded by the heavy steel control console. I saw my chance. I crawled toward the ventilation grate on the far wall. The screws were loose. I kicked it in. As I squeezed my body into the narrow shaft, leaving the chaos of the control room behind, I looked back one last time. The observation window shattered. Black mist began to pour into the control room from the silo. It wasn't smoke. It moved with intent. It swirled around the screaming mercenaries like a coil of snakes. I scrambled deeper into the vent, the screams behind me cutting off abruptly, replaced by a wet, tearing sound. I was alive. But I was deeper in the mountain than ever, and now, the thing in the basement was loose. And according to the mental map I had built, this vent didn't lead to the surface. It led to the sublevel, the water intake. Protocol Black wasn't a weapon. It was an organism. And I had just rung the dinner bell. The air in sublevel 3 didn't just smell stale. It tasted of copper and ancient, standing water. I checked the seal on my P100 respirator, tightening the straps until the rubber bit into my skin. The Geiger counter clipped to my mall webbing was clicking, not a frantic warning, but a steady, rhythmic metronome indicating low-level background radiation that shouldn't exist in a diesel-era naval depot. My boots crunched over something brittle. I didn't look down. In a place like this, you learn to trust the tactile feedback through your soles rather than wasting precious lumens checking every pile of debris. If it crunched, it was bone or glass. If it squished, you were in trouble. The schematic I'd recovered from the commander's office upstairs referenced this sector as Kurwakidai, Protocol Black. The kanji for containment was stamped repeatedly over the blueprints in red ink. I moved down the corridor, my carbine shouldered, keeping the weapon light focused on the center mass of the hallway. The walls here were different. The rough-hewn volcanic rock of the upper tunnels had been replaced by riveted steel plating, rusted to the color of dried blood. Condensation dripped from the ceiling pipes, pooling in the center of the walkway. I stepped wide, hugging the bulkheads. Tactical basics. Never walk where the enemy expects you to walk. Even if the enemy has been dead for 80 years. I reached a heavy blast door. The wheel was fused with oxidation. I holstered my weapon and pulled a small canister of thermite paste from my pouch, applying a thin bead around the hinges. This was high-stakes archaeology. If I used too much, I'd burn the oxygen in the hallway. Too little, and I'd be stuck. I ignited the strip and turned away, shielding my eyes as the magnesium flared white-hot, sizzling through the steel with a sound like tearing canvas. When the slag cooled, a swift kick sent the door groaning inward. Darkness poured out like a physical substance. I switched my optics to thermal. The room beyond was colder than the hallway, a deep blue void on the display, except for a cluster of heat signatures in the far corner. My heart hammered against my ribs. Heat meant biological activity. Or electronics. I raised the rifle, thumbing the safety off, and sliced the pie around the doorframe. The heat signatures weren't moving. I advanced, the silence of the bunker amplified by the rush of blood in my ears. It wasn't Japanese infantry. The bodies were piled against a bank of server racks that looked remarkably anachronistic next to the 1940s piping. I switched to white light to confirm what my brain was refusing to process. These men were wearing multicam black. Ops-core high-cut helmets, quad-tube panoramic night vision goggles, GPN VG-18s, the kind that cost 40 grand a pop. This was a Tier 1 extraction team. And they had been slaughtered. I knelt beside the nearest corpse. The patch on his shoulder was velcroed on, displaying a stylized hydra. Vanguard Solutions, I whispered, the sound deadened by my mask. Private military contractors. Mercenaries. They hadn't been here long. The rigor mortis had passed, but the decomposition was minimal. Maybe 3 days. I checked the body for wounds. No bullet holes. No shrapnel tears. I grabbed the dead man's plate carrier and heaved him over. His face was a mask of agony, eyes wide and ruptured, capillaries burst. His throat was swollen, purple and black, as if he'd swallowed a grenade that didn't go off. I scanned the room again, faster this time. There were 6 of them. A full fire team. Their weapons, HK-416s suppressed, were scattered, bolts locked back, magazines empty. They had fired everything they had. At what? The steel walls were pitted with 5.56mm impacts, but there was no blood on the walls, no sign of a fallen adversary. Just the dead operators and their spent brass. I moved to the center of the room, where a large, circular glass tank dominated the space. It was shattered. Thick, tempered glass, inches thick, blown outward, not inward. The floor around it was slick with a translucent, viscous slime that hadn't dried. I crouched, touching a gloved finger to the substance. It was sticky, resinous. My Geiger counter spiked. The radiation wasn't coming from the walls, it was coming from the slime. On a nearby desk, untouched by the chaos, lay a leather-bound logbook and a modern ruggedized tablet. I grabbed the tablet. Dead battery. I pocketed it. The logbook was older, Japanese naval issue. I flipped it open, scanning the columns of kanji. My Japanese was functional, learned from years of intercepting fishing communications in the South China Sea. The entries detailed Subject 8 retrieved from the Mariana Trench. They described it not as an animal, but as a biological amplifier. One entry stood out, circled in that same red ink. Asterisk, the protocol black is not a weapon we created. It is a pact we made. We feed it, and it grants us endurance. But the hunger is growing. It no longer accepts livestock. It requires higher cognitive function. Asterisk. A heavy, metallic clank echoed from the ventilation shaft above me. I froze. It wasn't the settling of the building. It was the deliberate movement of something heavy navigating the ducts. I killed my weapon light instantly, plunging the room into absolute darkness. I held my breath, listening. The sound moved. Asterisk clang. Scrape. Pause. Asterisk, it was directly above the shattered tank. I slowly retreated toward the door, keeping my weapon trained on the ceiling. My boot hit a spent casing, sending it skittering across the floor. The noise sounded like a gunshot in the silence. The movement in the vents stopped. Then, a low, wet chattering sound filled the room, like rocks grinding together underwater. It was a mimicry of speech, distorted and wrong. I didn't wait to identify it. I cleared the doorway and broke into a sprint back down the corridor, the darkness behind me feeling suddenly alive. I needed to find a defensible position, somewhere with a choke point. The mercenaries had emptied their magazines and died anyway. If a squad of pipe hitters with thermal optics and automatic weapons couldn't stop it, My single rifle wasn't going to be enough. I needed intel. I needed to charge that tablet. But first, I had to survive the next 5 minutes. As I rounded a corner, I nearly tripped over a tripwire I had missed on the way in. I skidded to a halt, the monofilament line glistening in the periphery of my NDGs. It was rigged to a Claymore mine, taped to the wall, modern, American-made. The Vanguard team had trapped their rear flank. They knew they were being hunted. I carefully stepped over the wire, a plan forming in my mind. If the thing in the vents was following my heat signature, I could use this. I moved 20 meters down the hall, tucked into an alcove, and aimed my rifle back at the tripwire. Waiting. The chattering sound grew louder, echoing off the steel plates. It was coming. The air grew heavier the deeper I went, a suffocating blanket of humidity mixed with the chemical tang of decayed rubber and stagnant, oily water. My Geiger counter clicked sporadically, not a constant warning scream, but a rhythmic, nervous tick that reminded me the containment shielding on the reactor level below was likely compromised. I adjusted the strap of my rifle, wiping sweat from my shooting eye. We were well past the administrative sections now. This was the gut of the beast. The architecture had shifted from the austere, utilitarian concrete of the 1940s Imperial Navy to something far more claustrophobic. The hallways were lined with thick piping, wrapped in asbestos insulation that was peeling away like dead skin, revealing rusted iron veins that pulsed with the phantom pressure of a facility that refused to die. According to the map I'd pulled from the dead officer in the comms room, I was entering Sector 4, Biological Material Processing. The map had been stamped with a red seal that simply read Kurwa Purotakeru, Protocol Black. I moved with the slow, deliberate cadence of a man hunting in a graveyard. Heel to toe, rolling the weight, keeping the noise discipline absolute. My boots were silent on the slick concrete, but the facility itself wasn't. It groaned. Thermal expansion, settling foundations, or something else, I couldn't tell. Every shadow cast by my shoulder-mounted lumen felt like a threat. I reached a bulkhead door, a massive slab of steel secured by a wheel mechanism that looked seized by 80 years of oxidation. But as I leaned in, inspecting the hinges for booby traps, I saw it. Fresh grease. Someone had serviced this door. Not recently, maybe a few years ago, but decades after the Japanese surrender. The implications chilled me faster than the damp draft leaking from the seal. I wasn't the first person to find this place. I probably wasn't even the first to die here. I holstered the rifle and gripped the wheel. It resisted, metal shrieking against metal, before giving way. The groaning echo traveled down the corridor, a dinner bell for anything listening. I drew my sidearm, a suppressed .45, and sliced the pie around the opening. The room beyond was a laboratory, or what was left of one. It wasn't destroyed. It was evacuated in a panic. Vials were smashed on the floor, the glass crunching under my boots like dry bones. In the center of the room stood 3 rows of vat-like containment units, shattered from the inside out. Whatever had been suspended in that formaldehyde solution hadn't been let out. It had broken out. I approached the nearest desk, sweeping the beam over scattered papers. Most were rotted pulp, but a leather-bound logbook had survived, preserved in a wax-sealed pouch. I cut it open. The kanji was hurried, erratic. My Japanese was functional, learned in dive bars in Okinawa and training exchanges in Hokkaido, but the technical jargon required focus. October 14th, 1944. Subject 7 shows no response to pain stimuli. The tissue regeneration rate exceeds projected models by 400%. The serum derived from the local parasitic fauna is stabilizing. However, aggression levels are uncontrollable. They do not recognize rank. They only recognize hunger. Asterisk. I flip the page. October 20th, 1944. Protocol Black is a failure. We haven't created soldiers. We have created ghouls. The commander has ordered the facility sealed. We are to inject the remaining subjects with cyanide. God help us, the needles broke against their skin. Asterisk. A noise froze me. A metallic clack. It came from the ventilation grid above my head. Not a rat. Rats scurry. This was weight shifting. I killed my light instantly, plunging the lab into an abyssal darkness. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I engaged my thermal monocular, the world turning into a wash of cool blues and grays. Above me, in the heat signature of the vents, nothing. But the sound repeated, a rhythmic tapping. Morse code? No. It was impact tremors. Steps. Boots on the walkway above the lab. I wasn't alone, but it wasn't the subjects I was worried about. I slid into the knee well of the desk, training the 45 on the doorway I just entered. Through the silence, voices drifted down. Clipped. Professional. American accents. Sweep the sector. Bravo team, secure the perimeter. If you see the scavenger, put him down. We need the samples intact. Mercenaries. High tier. Probably ex-DevGru or SAS contracting for a private interest. They weren't here for gold. They were here for the serum. They knew about Protocol Black. I checked my mag 7 rounds. I had my rifle, but in this tight space, the pistol was faster. I needed an exit. The map in my head placed a freight elevator at the rear of the lab, leading down to the geothermal power plant. If I could get there, I could vanish into the steam tunnels. A flash-bang canister clattered into the room. I didn't wait for the bang. I vaulted the desk, sprinting for the rear blast doors just as the world turned white and a deafening crack overpressured the room. My ears rang, a high-pitched whine drowning out the world, but I was already moving. "Contact front!" a voice screamed. I slid across the wet floor, bringing the rifle up. 2 silhouettes filled the doorway, backlit by their own tactical lights. Their movement was fluid, aggressive. I fired twice. Controlled pairs. The first round sparked off a ceramic plate carrier. The second caught the lead operator in the throat. He dropped without a sound. The second operator peeled right, taking cover behind a tipped workbench. Suppressed fire chewed up the concrete inches from my face, sending stone splinters into my cheek. I scrambled behind one of the smashed containment vats. The glass was thick, bullet-resistant. Target is suppressed. Flanking left. They were good. They were communicating, closing the net. I pulled a frag grenade from my rig, an old M67 I'd bartered for in Manila. I pulled the pin, cooked it for 2 seconds, and lobbed it over the vat. Asterisk thump. Asterisk. The explosion shook the dust from the ceiling. A scream followed, cut short. I broke cover, pushing through the smoke. The freight elevator was 10 meters away. I hit the call button. Nothing. The power was dead here. Damn it! I holstered the rifle and jammed my fingers into the gap of the elevator doors. I heaved, the muscles in my back screaming. The doors parted enough for a man to squeeze through. I looked down the shaft. It was a black throat going down into hell. A single cable hung in the center, greasy and frayed. Behind me, more beams of light cut through the smoke. He's at the shaft! Frag out! I didn't hesitate. I jumped, grabbing the greasy cable with gloved hands. The friction burned through the leather instantly, heat searing my palms as I plummeted. I clamped my boots around the wire, braking hard, jerking to a halt 20 feet down just as the grenade detonated above. The shockwave hammered me, swinging me like a pendulum against the concrete wall of the shaft. I hung there, gasping, the copper taste of adrenaline flooding my mouth. Above, the voices were shouting orders. They would rappel down any second. I looked down. Below me, perhaps another 50 feet, a red emergency light pulsed weakly. Sub-level 3. The power station. And something else. The air rushing up the shaft didn't smell like rot anymore. It smelled like ozone and meat. Cooked meat. I slid down the cable, ignoring the burning in my hands. I reached the landing doors of sub-level 3 and pried them open with my combat knife. I rolled onto the grating, bringing my weapon up immediately. The space was vast, dominated by massive turbines that were silent, dusty giants. But in the center of the room, rigged to the main breaker panel, was a modern laptop. Its screen glowed blue in the dark. I approached it, keeping my perimeter check tight. A progress bar was on the screen. Upload complete, 98%. Someone was stealing the data. Someone was here before the mercenaries. Then I saw the bodies. 3 of the mercenaries, the same gear as the ones upstairs, were scattered around the turbines. They hadn't been shot. They had been torn apart. Limbs were twisted at impossible angles. Ceramic plates were shattered by blunt force trauma that no human could generate. I knelt by one of the bodies. His throat had been ripped out. Not cut. Asterisk bitten. Asterisk. I looked back at the screen. 99%. A sound came from the shadows behind the turbines. A wet, guttural rattle. It wasn't human. It was the sound of lungs filled with fluid trying to draw breath. I realized then that the logbook was wrong. Subject 7 hadn't expired. And the mercenaries upstairs weren't the hunters. We were all just fresh meat entering the cage. 100%. The laptop screen flashed upload complete, then went black. In the reflection of the dark screen, I saw movement behind me. Pale. Gaunt. Too tall to be a man. I spun around, triggering the strobe light on my rifle to blind it. The creature hissed, shielding eyes that had no pupils. It wore the tattered remnants of an Imperial Navy uniform, fused to its gray, leathery skin. It smiled, revealing rows of jagged, translucent teeth. "Protocol Black," I whispered. It didn't attack. It just watched me, tilting its head like a curious bird. Then, from the elevator shaft, the mercenaries began to rappel down. The creature looked at the cables, then back at me. It raised a finger to its lips in a mocking human gesture of silence, and vanished into the steam pipes with speed that defied physics. The boots of the kill team hit the metal grating behind me. I was caught between a high-tech firing squad and a biological nightmare from 1944. I racked the slide of my rifle. Time to get to work. The air in Sector 4 didn't just smell old, it smelled charged, a distinct metallic tang of ozone layering over the rot of 80 years. I checked the display on the Geiger counter strapped to my webbing. The needle was dancing, not in the red, but climbing steadily with every meter I pushed deeper into the subterranean complex. The humidity had dropped, replaced by a bone-dry chill that suggested industrial-grade climate control. Somehow still functioning on auxiliary power or geothermal vents. My breath hitched in my throat, not from fear, but from the realization that the hum I'd been feeling in the soles of my boots wasn't the jungle above settling, it was a generator. I moved to condition black on my mental checklist. The jungle survival phase was over. This was now a tactical ingress into a hostile, fortified structure. I switched my carbine to my weak shoulder to slice the corner of a heavy blast door, the rusted hinges groaning like dying beasts. Beyond lay a corridor lined with conduit pipes, thick as pythons, pulsing with a faint, rhythmic vibration. The walls here weren't the rough-hewn rock of the upper tunnels. This was poured concrete, smooth and seamless, unmarked by time. That's when I saw the light discipline failure. 50 meters down the hall, a beam of white light cut through the gloom, sweeping the floor. It wasn't the yellow, dying flicker of an incandescent bulb. It was the crisp, blue-white throw of a modern LED tactical illuminator. I froze, melting into the recess of a support pillar. The silhouette behind the light moved with a fluidity that screamed professional training. High-cut ballistic helmet, Peltacom's headsets, plate carrier with a tight administrative pouch setup. This wasn't a scavenger or a lost tourist. This was a Tier 1 cleanup crew. I counted 3 of them moving in a standard bounding Overwatch formation. They weren't looking for artifacts, they were sweeping for biologicals. The lead operator raised a fist. Halt. He tapped his helmet, seemingly listening to chatter I couldn't intercept. Sector clear. Biological readings negative, but thermal residue is fresh. A voice echoed, distorted by the tunnel acoustics but clear enough. American accent. Flat. Professional. Target is likely hostile and mobile. Rules of engagement. Sanitize. Sanitize. They weren't here to capture. They were here to erase the mistake of me finding this place. I was outgunned. My kit was built for jungle endurance. A machete, a reliable but civilian-grade AR-15 with 3 mags, and basic medical. They had suppressed SBRs, night vision, and team comms. A direct firefight was a suicide pact. I needed to leverage the environment. I scanned the immediate area. To my left, a heavy bulkhead door with the stenciled warning in faded kanji and English, "Pressure control, do not obstruct." I unclipped a smoke canister from my belt, my only one. I waited. The point man took a step forward, his weapon light scanning the ceiling, checking for the very traps I had barely survived in Chapter 3. I pulled the pin, holding the lever down, counting the heartbeats. 1. 2. I lobbed the canister down the hall. It clattered loudly against the concrete. "Contact front!" The corridor erupted. Their reaction was instantaneous and terrifyingly precise. Suppressed rounds snapped through the air, sparking against the walls around me. The sound was a series of sharp cracks, barely louder than a staple gun, but the impact was lethal. The smoke bloomed, filling the narrow hallway with thick, gray concealment. I didn't return fire. Instead, I yanked the wheel of the pressure control door. It was seized. I slammed the butt of my rifle against the locking mechanism, adrenaline overriding the preservation of my weapon. The rust shattered. I spun the wheel, threw my weight against the iron, and fell through the gap just as a spray of 5.56mm rounds chewed up the doorframe where my head had been a second earlier. I dogged the door shut from the inside, spinning the inner wheel until the locking bars slammed home. A thud vibrated through the metal a second later. A breaching charge? No, a kick. They were testing the seal. Then, the hiss of a cutting torch began. I had maybe 3 minutes before they cut the lock. I turned to face my sanctuary. It wasn't a maintenance room. It was an archive. Rows of filing cabinets lined the walls, but the centerpiece was a massive mahogany desk, strangely preserved in the dry air. On it lay a chaotic spread of documents, maps, and a modern ruggedized laptop that had been smashed with a blunt object, likely a rifle butt. The screen was shattered, but the hard drive casing was ripped open. Someone had tried to destroy the data in a hurry. I scrambled to the desk, my hands shaking as I sifted through the papers. The headers were dual language, Japanese Imperial Navy and German. Imperial Japanese Navy Special Unit 731/Kriegsmarine Joint Project. Date, October 1944. Subject, Protocol Black the Organism. I grabbed a dossier marked with a red wax seal. The photos inside were grainy, black and white, but the horror was high definition. They showed human subjects, POWs likely, submerged in the same black liquid I had seen in the vials upstairs. But they weren't drowning. They were changing. The text below the photo was a mix of scientific observation and occult terror. Subject 44B exhibits rapid calcification of the dermis. Bullet resistance increased by 400%. Cognitive function lost. Aggression uncontrollable. The black fluid does not kill, it rewrites. I flipped the page. A newer document fell out. This one was typed on crisp white paper, dated August 12, 2023. Asterisk. Project Blackwater Recovery Log. The dormant samples in sublevel 5 remain viable. The mutation rate is faster than the 1944 projections. We advise immediate extraction of the Queen sample. Use the sanitized protocol for any local witnesses. Asterisk. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a leftover war crime. A private military corporation had reactivated it. They were farming whatever biological horror Unit 731 had discovered here. Behind me, the door groaned. The tip of a blue flame pierced the steel, glowing like an angry star. Molten metal dripped onto the floor. They were coming through. I looked for an exit. The room was a dead end, save for a ventilation grate high on the back wall. It was too small for a human, but the bolts were rusted. If I could pry it open, I might be able to squeeze into the ductwork. I dragged a filing cabinet under the vent. I climbed up, jamming my machete into the gap between the grate and the wall. I heaved, the metal screaming in protest. The cutting torch behind me was tracing a neat circle around the lock mechanism. The door gave a shudder. With a final, desperate wrench, the grate popped loose, clattering to the floor. I didn't hesitate. I shoved my pack in first, then hauled myself up, wiggling my hips through the narrow opening just as the blast door blew inward with a concussive thump. Room clear! Check the corners! I froze in the darkness of the duct, pulling my legs in. I was lying in dust and rat droppings, peering through the open vent. Below, 3 operators swept into the room, weapons raised. Their movements were jerky, agitated. He's gone! Check the vent, one ordered. A beam of light shot up, blinding me. I scrambled backward into the depths of the duct, scraping my elbows and knees raw against the galvanized steel. Contact in the vent! Frag out! Asterisk shit. Asterisk. I scrambled, clawing forward on my stomach, ignoring the searing pain of tearing skin. The explosion behind me was deafening. The overpressure slammed me forward, smashing my face into the metal floor of the duct. My ears rang with a high-pitched whine that drowned out the world. Dust and debris choked the air. I lay there for a moment, stunned, tasting copper. I coughed, trying to clear my lungs. As the ringing in my ears faded, I heard something else. It wasn't the soldiers. It was a wet, slithering sound coming from deeper inside the ventilation shaft ahead of me. A low, guttural chittering. I looked back toward the opening. The grenade had collapsed the entrance I came through. I was trapped in the ventilation system. I looked forward. My tack light flickered, the batteries dying from the impact. In the strobing gloom, about 20 feet ahead, the duct widened into a junction. Something was moving there. Something that reflected the light with a slick, oily sheen. It was black, viscous, and it was clinging to the ceiling of the shaft. It dropped to the floor of the duct with a heavy, wet slap. I raised my pistol, my hand shaking violently. The soldiers below were the least of my problems now. The 1944 dossier had mentioned asterisk. Uncontrollable aggression. Asterisk it hadn't mentioned that the things could navigate the vents. Protocol Black was active. And I was in the tube with it. The concrete pillar 6 inches from my face disintegrated, showering me in a jagged spray of 80-year-old aggregate and fresh lead. I didn't flinch. Adrenaline had long since replaced the capacity for surprise with a cold, vibrating hyperfocus. I chucked tighter behind the rusted remains of what looked like a diesel generator. Checking the magazine of the Type 100 submachine gun I'd scavenged from the skeletal grip of the base commander 2 levels up. It was a desperate tool, an open-bolt relic firing 8mm Nambu rounds that were more likely to jam than cycle, but my Glock was dry. And the modern assault rifle I'd taken from the first mercenary I killed was shattered. Flanking left! Flash out! The voice echoed down the damp corridor, distorted by a gas mask but unmistakably American. Professional. Calm. These weren't scavengers. They were a cleanup crew, likely funded by whichever shadowy conglomerate had inherited the imperial sins buried in this rock. I counted the heartbeat between the shout and the detonation. *1. 2. I squeezed my eyes shut and clamped my hands over my ears just as the flash bang detonated. The concussive thump rattled my teeth. But the blinding magnesium flare only washed out the darkness behind my eyelids rather than scorching my retinas. I moved instantly. Tactical doctrine dictates that the assault team breaches immediately after the bang. I rolled out from cover, not away from the enemy, but toward the low ground, a maintenance trench running parallel to the corridor, filled with 3 inches of brackish, oily water. I hit the sludge chest first, the freezing shock punching the breath out of me, and leveled the Type 100. Through the grate above, I saw boots. Heavy, rubber-soled combat boots moving in a synchronized stack. I squeezed the trigger. The ancient weapon chugged to life, a slow, rhythmic stutter compared to the buzzsaw rate of modern weapons. Asterisk thud 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 thud. Asterisk. The 8mm rounds punched upward through the rusted grating. I heard a scream, a wet thud, and the chaotic shouting of men realizing their kill box had just become a fatal funnel. I didn't wait to confirm the kill. I scrambled through the muck, sliding deeper into the facility's bowels, moving beneath the floor while they sprayed the generator room with suppressed fire. My lungs burned. The air down here was thick, tasting of copper and heavy mold. I emerged 200 meters down the line, pushing up a grate that groaned in protest. I was in a new sector. The walls here weren't bare concrete. They were lined with white ceramic tiles, most of them cracked or stained with a brown residue that I desperately hoped was rust. Above the blast door ahead, a faded painted sign in kanji read, * Special Pathogen Containment Level 4. *. This was it. The heart of the mystery. The reason for the traps, the secrecy, and the kill team on my heels. I jammed the heavy iron wheel of the bulkhead door. It refused to budge. The mechanism was seized by decades of oxidation. I could hear the mercenaries regrouping down the hall, the rhythmic thwip-thwip of their boots on the concrete getting louder. Desperate, I used the stock of the Type 100 as a hammer, smashing the locking pin. With a scream of tearing metal, the wheel turned. I slipped inside and spun the wheel back just as the first bullets sparked off the steel surface. Inside, the silence was absolute. The room was a laboratory, preserved in a vacuum of terror. Rows of stainless steel tables stood in perfect alignment. On the far wall, shattered glass containment tanks lined the perimeter, their contents long since evaporated or escaped. But on the central desk, illuminated by the sweep of my tactical light, lay a leather-bound ledger. I approached it, my weapon raised, checking the corners. Clear. I opened the book. The paper was brittle, the ink faded but legible. My Japanese was rusty, learned from years of intercepting radio chatter, but the headers were clear. Asterisk Protocol Black, Kawakiri. Date, August 14, 1945. Asterisk. The date sent a chill through me. The day before the surrender. While the Emperor was preparing to end the war, this base was initiating something else. I scanned the final entry. Asterisk. Subject 73 has breached containment. The physiological enhancements provided by the serum have exceeded projections. Cellular regeneration is instantaneous, but cognitive degradation is total. It is not a soldier anymore. It is a biological engine of consumption. The Americans are coming, but we cannot let them find this. We cannot let it leave. General Tojo has authorized Protocol Black. We are sealing the blast doors from the outside. We are trapped in here with it. May the Buddhas have mercy on our souls. Asterisk. My breath hitched. Protocol Black wasn't a weapon launch. It was a self-imposed tomb. They hadn't abandoned the base. They had quarantined it. They locked themselves in the dark to keep something from getting out. A heavy metallic clang echoed from the ventilation shaft above me. It wasn't the mercenaries. It was too heavy, too clumsy yet fast. It sounded like wet meat slapping against steel. I looked at the shattered containment tanks again. The glass hadn't been broken from the outside. The shards were scattered outward, across the floor. Whatever was in there had broken out. The bulkhead door behind me began to hiss. The mercenaries were cutting through with a thermal lance. Sparks showered the floor, painting the room in flickering orange light. I was trapped between a Tier 1 kill squad and a biological nightmare that had apparently survived 80 years in the dark. I grabbed the ledger, the only proof of what happened here, and scanned the room for an exit. There was only one other door, heavily reinforced, marked Incinerator Access/Sublevel 5. The ventilation grate above the central table buckled. A long, pale limb, grotesquely elongated and glistening with the secreted resin, slipped through the opening. It had too many joints. The thermal lance punched through the main door. The lock melted. I didn't hesitate. I sprinted for the incinerator access. I wasn't running to escape the mercenaries anymore. I was running because the thing in the ceiling had just dropped to the floor with a sound like a wet sack of cement. And it was unfurling to its full height. As I slammed the heavy incinerator door behind me and spun the lock, I heard the mercenaries breach the room. Target acquired. Drop the weapon. The command was cut off by a guttural, vibrating screech that sounded like tearing metal. Then came the gunfire, panic fire, full auto, undisciplined. Then the screaming started. It wasn't the scream of men fighting a war. It was the scream of men being disassembled. I backed away from the door, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The screams on the other side were wet and brief. Then, silence returned, heavier than before. I turned my flashlight to the path ahead. The tunnel sloped downward, deeper into the earth, into the heat and the dark. The air here was hot, smelling of sulfur and ancient ash. I checked the Type 100. 7 rounds left. I had the ledger. I had the truth. But now, I was in the only place the creature hadn't gone yet, the fire pit. I moved forward, the darkness swallowing the beam of my light. The deeper I went, the more I realized the architecture was changing. The smooth concrete gave way to rough-hewn rock, and then to something else, structures that looked less like military bunkers and more like a temple. The walls were covered in scratched warnings, frantic messages carved by the doomed soldiers of the Imperial Navy. Asterisk. Don't sleep. Asterisk. Asterisk. It hears your heartbeat. Asterisk. Asterisk. The Black Protocol is not a cure. Asterisk. I reached the bottom of the ramp. A massive cavern opened up before me, lit by the faint, dying glow of emergency amber lights running on geothermal backup. In the center of the cavern sat a massive, circular structure resembling a blast furnace, but covered in Shinto prayer ropes and talismans. And standing between me and the furnace was a man. Or what used to be a man. He was wearing the tattered remains of a modern tactical vest, gray digital camo, same as the team upstairs. But he was standing perfectly still, facing away from me. Friendly? I whispered, knowing the answer before I asked. The figure turned slowly. His face was gone. In its place was a blooming mass of black fungal matter, pulsing in time with a heartbeat that was much too slow to be human. He raised his rifle, not at me, but at his own head. Run! He gurgled, the voice bypassing the fungus choking his throat. Protocol is awake. He pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed endlessly in the cavern, waking the things sleeping in the shadows of the furnace. Hundreds of eyes, reflecting my flashlight beam, snapped open in the dark. Protocol Black wasn't just one creature. It was a hive. The concussion grenade detonated with a force that felt less like a sound and more like a physical blow to the sternum, sucking the oxygen out of the narrow corridor. I scrambled backward, my boots slipping on 70 years of accumulated sludge and condensation. My ears ringing with a high-pitched whine that drowned out the shouting of the men pursuing me. I didn't know who they were, mercenaries, a private cleanup crew, or some black-budget wet work team, but they moved with the distinct, fluid aggression of operators who knew exactly what they were looking for. And they weren't looking for gold. I dragged myself behind a rusted bulkhead door, the heavy iron will cold against my palm. I put my shoulder into it, gritting my teeth against the searing pain of the shrapnel graze on my left thigh, and heaved. The hinges screamed, a sound of tearing metal that echoed too loudly in the subterranean silence. I managed to close it just as the beam of a tactical light cut through the dust clouds where I had been standing seconds before. I spun the locking wheel. It seized halfway. I hammered it with the butt of my Glock. forcing the locking pins to engage with a dull thud just as bullets began to spark against the other side of the steel. I was alone. Sub-level 4. The air down here was different, stale, heavy, and tasting of ozone and something sweet, like rotting fruit. My flashlight flickered, the batteries dying. I tapped it against my palm, the beam stabilizing on a wall covered in faded kanji and red warning stripes. I didn't need to be fluent to understand the universality of a biohazard symbol, though this one was drawn with slight variations. Archaic and sharp-edged. I checked my magazine. 4 rounds. I had 1 spare mag with 7 rounds left. 11 shots to fight off a paramilitary squad equipped with night vision and body armor. Tactical retreat was no longer an option. I had to disappear into the bowels of this facility and become part of the hazard. I moved deeper, keeping low. The architecture changed here. The utilitarian concrete of the upper naval base gave way to something more clinical, insulated with crumbling asbestos and lead lining. This was the heart of the anomaly. I found a heavy canvas tarp draped over a stack of crates. Pulling it back, I expected munitions. Instead, I found glass canisters, shatterproof and sealed with wax, sitting in shock-absorbing straw. Inside was a viscous, black liquid that seemed to absorb the light from my torch rather than reflect it. I'd pulled a logbook from a desk that had collapsed under the weight of moisture and time. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but the header was stamped clearly in English. Likely for the eyes of high-ranking captured intelligence officers or collaborators. Protocol Black Dispersal Matrix. I scanned the frantic final entries, dated August 1945. The handwriting was jagged, terrified. Subject 7 exhibits total loss of pain reception. Adrenal production increased 400%. Necrosis of the frontal lobe. They are not dead, they just do not stop. My blood ran cold. Protocol Black wasn't a bomb. It wasn't a virus intended for the American mainland. It was a combat stimulant derived from a local parasitic fungus, refined to strip a soldier of fear, pain, and reason. It was the ultimate scorched earth policy. If an invasion was imminent, the protocol was to be released into the base's air supply, turning the thousands of stationed sailors into rabid, unkillable berserkers who would tear the enemy apart with their bare hands before succumbing to organ failure days later. But the order to release it had been halted. The entry log ended with a single word: containment. A metallic clank echoed through the ventilation shaft above me. The squad had bypassed the bulkhead. I didn't have time to read more. I shoved the logbook into my pack and scanned the room for an advantage. My eyes landed on the ventilation control panel. It was a massive industrial setup, powered by a separate breaker system. The needles on the pressure gauges were dead, but the pneumatic lines looked intact. If I could repressurize the lower quadrant, I could use the noise and the sudden airflow to mask my movement. Or perhaps vent the stifling air that was making my head swim. I moved to the breaker box, bypassing the rusted fuses with the copper wire from my broken radio. A spark hissed, illuminating the dark room in a strobe of blue light. Somewhere deep in the walls, a turbine groaned, trying to spin after decades of dormancy. The lights in the corridor flickered on, dim, yellow, powered by the dying breath of the emergency auxiliary. That's when I saw them. Through the reinforced observation glass of the adjacent room, illuminated by the flickering yellow hazard lights. They weren't just bodies. They were the crew. Mummified by the hermetically sealed environment of the lab, they stood or sat in unnatural positions. But as the turbine vibrated the floor, one of the desiccated figures shifted. It wasn't alive. It couldn't be. It was the vibration sliding the dry corpse across the floor. But the terrifying part was the claw marks on the inside of the glass. They hadn't died from the enemy. They had been sealed in here by their own commanders when the protocol went wrong. The door to the lab hissed. The pressure change from my tampering was overriding the magnetic locks. Behind me, the corridor door breached. The tactical team poured in, weapons raised. "Contact front! Drop the weapon!" A voice boomed, distorted by a gas mask. I looked at the mercenaries, then at the slowly opening door of the containment lab where the air was thick with the dried spores of the black dust. I looked at the canisters of liquid next to me. High stakes meant making a choice that no sane person would make. I didn't raise my hands. Instead, I raised my pistol and aimed not at the soldiers, but at the overhead sprinkler valve labeled emergency flush. "Don't do it!" The lead mercenary shouted, realizing the room was rigged. "You have no idea what's in this facility." "I know exactly what it is." I rasped, my throat dry. "It's the reason you're wearing masks and I'm not." I fired. The bullet shattered the valve. It wasn't water that came out. The system was tied to the reserve chemical tanks. A hiss of compressed gas screamed into the room, kicking up the dust, swirling the ancient spores into a frenzy. The mercenaries hesitated, their flashlights cutting through the sudden fog. I held my breath, dropped to the floor, and rolled toward the service hatch I had spotted earlier near the floorboards. As I shimmied into the tight, crawl-space darkness, I heard the soldiers coughing. Even with masks, the skin exposure to the concentrated agent was reacting. I heard panic. Then I heard the scream of a man whose pain receptors were being chemically stripped away, replaced by pure, blinding aggression. Protocol Black had just been reactivated, and I was trapped in the walls with the test subjects. The concussive thud of the flash bang was more of a physical shove than a sound. A pressurized slam against my eardrums that turned the world into a high-pitched whine. I didn't wait for the vision to clear. Muscle memory, drilled into me through years of contracting work that paid too little for risks too high, took over. I rolled hard over the wet, moss-slicked concrete of the generator room floor. Scrambling behind the rusted bulk of a massive diesel engine block just as the suppression fire tore through the space I had occupied a heartbeat prior. The air filled with the sharp, biting scent of pulverized limestone and ancient rust, mixed with the acrid ozone of modern propellants. "Sector 4 clear! Push left!" The voice was distorted by a throat mic, professional, clipped. These weren't scavengers. The strike team from the Aegis PMC moved with the fluid lethality of a pack of wolves. I counted 4 heat signatures on my peripheral vision before the flash blinded me, but the cadence of their fire suggested at least 6. They were running 5. 56mm suppressed carbines, probably SIGs or HKs, judging by the cyclic rate. I checked my own magazine, 12 rounds of 9mm left in the SIG P320. And a single frag grenade I'd lifted off the body of their point man in the tunnels above. I needed depth. The surface was death. The only way out was down, into the throat of the facility where the Japanese Imperial Navy had buried their secrets, in 1944. I scrambled on hands and knees, the jagged edges of corroded grating slicing into my palms, and dropped into a maintenance sub-channel. The darkness down here was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed against my eyes. I kept my flashlight off. They would have night vision, expensive, Gen 3 panoramic tubes. Light was suicide. I had to navigate by touch, and the phantom map burned into my mind from the blueprints I'd glimpsed in the comms room. My boots splashed into ankle-deep water. It was warm, unnervingly so. The geothermal vents that powered this place were leaking. I moved fast, keeping my profile low, counting my paces. 50 meters to the blast doors of Section K9. The Japanese characters for biocontainment had been stenciled on the bulkheads I passed earlier, red paint faded to the color of dried blood. This was where the mystery of Protocol Black lived. It wasn't gold. It wasn't experimental aircraft. It was biology. Above me, the rhythmic thud of boots on the metal grating tracked my movement. They were triangulating. I needed a distraction. I unclipped the frag grenade, pulled the pin, and counted to 2. I didn't throw it at them. I dropped it down a drainage pipe to my left, counting on the acoustics of the sewer system. I surged forward. The explosion was muffled, a deep whump that shook the floor plates, followed instantly by the sound of collapsing pipework echoing from the west wing. "Contact west! Shift fire!" the leader barked above. I bought myself 10 seconds. I reached the heavy blast door of Section K9. It was sealed with a rusted wheel mechanism, the locking bars thick as my arm. But the steel around the hinges had been compromised by 80 years of jungle humidity and salt air. I braced my back against the wall and kicked the lever with everything I had left. The shriek of metal shearing against metal was deafening, echoing like a banshee scream in the dark. The door groaned and swung inward just enough for me to slip through. I was inside. The air here was different. It didn't smell like rot. It smelled sterile, metallic, with a faint underlying scent of almonds. Cyanide? No preservatives. I clicked on my low-lumen red light, shielding the beam with my fingers. The room was a cathedral of science gone wrong. Rows of glass cylinders, tall as men, lined the walls. Most were shattered, their contents reduced to dried, indistinguishable stains on the floor. But 3 at the far end were intact. I moved closer, my weapon raised. The fluid inside was murky, amber-colored, illuminated by the faint phosphorescent decay of the chemicals. Inside the first tank suspended in the liquid was a suit. Not a dive suit, but an armored sealed environment suit, bulky and primitive, connected to filtration units that looked far too advanced for 1944. I wiped the dust from a console. The logbook was there, preserved in a wax-sealed pouch. I slid it open. The kanji was frantic, scrawled with a brush that had clearly been shaking. I scanned the pages, my limited Japanese straining to translate the technical jargon. October 12, 1944. The samples from Unit 731 arrived. Admiral Yamashita believes this is the shield that will save the Empire. We call it Kawakiri, black fog. It is not a weapon to kill the enemy. It is a weapon to deny them the earth. The aerosolized strain doesn't just kill, it fuses with the flora. It makes the jungle itself hostile to human physiology. We are not sealing the base to keep Americans out. We are sealing it to keep the fog in. Asterisk. My blood ran cold. Protocol Black wasn't a dormant bomb. It was an environmental mutagen. And the Aegis team, they weren't here to destroy it. They were here to harvest it. The amber liquid in the tanks wasn't just preservative, it was the culture medium. End of the line, scavenger. The voice came from the darkness behind me. No footsteps. No creak of leather. I froze. Slowly I turned. A single figure stood in the breach of the door I had forced open. He was massive, clad in matte black tactical gear, his face obscured by a ballistic mandible mask. He held a suppressed vector pointed at my chest, but he didn't fire. He tapped the side of his helmet, and the external speakers amplified his voice. "You're breathing it right now," he said, his tone conversational, almost bored. "The seal was broken when you forced the door. The spores are dormant, but once they hit the humidity of your lungs, well..." He gestured vaguely with his offhand. "Your Aegis Actual," I said, stalling. My hand hovered inches from the valve of a pressurized steam pipe running along the console. "Call me Kane. And you've complicated a very expensive extraction operation. That culture," he nodded to the tanks, "is worth more than the GDP of the country you're standing in. We have the antidote. You don't." "Let me guess," I rasped, feeling a sudden tickle in the back of my throat that I prayed was psychosomatic. "I carry a sample out for you, and you give me the shot?" Kane chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "No. You're a loose end. Loose ends don't get negotiated with. They get cauterized." He tightened his grip on the trigger. I didn't go for my gun. I dropped. As I fell, I grabbed the steam valve and wrenched it clockwise. The 80-year-old gasket blew instantly. A jet of superheated steam, pressurized by the geothermal activity below, screamed out of the pipe like a dragon's breath, creating a white wall between me and Kane. His gunfire erupted, blind bursts tearing through the steam, sparking against the machinery. I rolled into the gap between the tanks, the heat blistering my skin. The room was filling with white fog, hot, blinding, and loud. I had turned the kill zone into a sauna of chaos. I scrambled toward the rear of the lab, coughing, the taste of almonds now strong in my mouth. There was a service hatch in the floor, marked with yellow warning stripes. I didn't check what was below. I smashed the latch with the butt of my pistol and threw it open. "He's flushing the system," Kane shouted, his voice cutting through the hiss of steam. "Kill him before he breaches the containment seal." Bullets sparked off the rim of the hatch. I dropped into the darkness just as a frag grenade clattered onto the floor above me. I pulled the hatch shut and locked the wheel seconds before the detonation slammed against the steel from above, blowing dust into my eyes. I was alone again, sliding down a smooth, angled chute. I hit the bottom hard, sliding into a pile of something soft and dry. I fumbled for my light, clicking it on with trembling hands. The beam cut through the gloom. I wasn't in a sewer. I was in a silo. And all around me, stacked in neat, terrifying rows, were thousands of canisters marked with the black fog insignia. But the terrifying part wasn't the canisters. It was the skeleton sitting in the chair at the control desk in front of me, wearing a rusted Imperial officer's uniform. In its skeletal hand, it held a revolver. On the desk, carved into the metal with a knife, was a final message in English, a warning left for whoever came next. Asterisk it evolves. Asterisk. Above me, the hatch wheel began to turn. Kane was coming. And I was trapped in the belly of the beast with the very thing that could end the world. Armed with half a magazine and a lungful of potentially poisoned air. The water had risen to waist height, a brackish slurry of seawater, hydraulic fluid, and the liquefied decay of 80 years. Every step through the submerged corridor was a tactical nightmare. The drag against my legs slowed my movement to a lethargic waiting pace, while the sloshing noise masked any audio cues from the darkness ahead. I held the 18 Malawin Quachas high against my shoulder, the stock pressed tight into the pocket of my plate carrier, keeping the optic clear of the filth. My breathing was ragged, magnified in my ears by the confined acoustics of the concrete tunnel. I checked the Trichum watch on my wrist. 14 minutes. That was the generous estimate before the structural integrity of the main bulkheads, already compromised by the charges I'd set in the upper atrium, gave way completely. The facility wasn't just flooding, it was dying, groaning under the immense pressure of the mountain above and the sea below. I reached the heavy blast door marked with the distinct red lacquer of the Imperial seal, now faded to the color of dried blood. This was it. The epicenter. The schematics I'd pulled from the dead lieutenant's satchel in Chapter 6 called this the oubliette. It was where Protocol Black had been born. I hooked a fresh chem light to my vest, the sickly green glow illuminating the particulates floating in the stagnant air, and keyed the manual override wheel. It wouldn't budge. Rust had fused the locking mechanism. I shifted my grip, slinging the rifle and pulling the pry bar from my pack. It was a crude solution for a delicate situation, but finesse had died 3 levels up. I jammed the steel wedge into the seam, leaning my entire body weight against it. The metal screamed, a high-pitched shriek that echoed down the tunnel behind me, and the seal cracked. A hiss of escaping air, stale and smelling of ozone and copper, rushed past me. The pressure differential was massive. I wasn't opening a room. I was unsealing a tomb. Inside, the water level dropped significantly. The room was tiered, a vast amphitheater of machinery descending into a central pit. Emergency lighting, triggered by the seismic tremors of the collapsing base, flickered in strobe-like bursts, casting long, jerking shadows against the riveted walls. I raised my weapon, slicing the pie as I cleared the entryway, scanning for movement. The silence here was heavy, physical. In the center of the room, suspended by massive chains that looked like they belonged on a battleship's anchor, hung a sphere of dull, leaden metal. It was roughly 3 meters in diameter, scarred by welding torches and etched with warnings in archaic kanji. This was the payload. Not a bomb. A vessel. I moved to the control console overlooking the pit. The skeletons of the command crew were still at their posts, but they weren't slumped over. They were fused to the metal. Their bones had calcified, growing into the steel panels, ribs merging with levers, skulls encased in headset wires. It wasn't decay, it was integration. I wiped the grime off the central logbook, the paper brittle as glass. The final entry, dated August 14, 1945, didn't speak of surrender. It spoke of containment failure. The handwriting was frantic. The specimen does not die. It adapts. It rewrites the flesh. Protocol Black is not a weapon to be used. It is a grave to be sealed. We are the mortar. A wet, slapping sound echoed from the pit. I spun, bringing the red dot of my optic to bear on the lead sphere. A hairline fracture had appeared on its surface. A black, viscous fluid was weeping from the crack, dripping onto the grating below. But the fluid didn't pool. It moved. It coalesced, pulling itself together against gravity, forming pseudopods that tested the air. My Geiger counter, clipped to my belt, began to chatter, not the steady click of radiation, but a chaotic, rhythmic buzzing. Interference. Biological resonance. The fluid wasn't just leaking, it was signaling. Then I saw them. From the shadows beneath the gantry, the survivors emerged. They weren't human anymore. They were the crew mentioned in the logs, the ones who hadn't fused to the consoles. Their skin was translucent, stretched taut over elongated limbs that had extra joints. They moved with a twitching, insectal speed, clinging to the underside of the walkways. No eyes, just smooth patches of pale flesh where faces used to be. They hunted by sound. And I was loud. I switched the fire selector to semi-automatic. Conservation was key. I had 2 magazines left. Contact front, I whispered to no one, centering the reticle on the lead creature. I squeezed the trigger. The crack of the suppressed shot was swallowed by the room's vastness. The round took the creature in the center of mass. It didn't drop. It absorbed the impact, the flesh rippling like water, and shrieked, a sound that felt like a needle in my eardrum. The others reacted instantly, scrambling over the railings, closing the distance with terrifying velocity. I adjusted my aim, going for the joints. The next shot shattered a knee, sending the creature tumbling into the pit. I retreated toward the blast door, firing controlled pairs. Pop pop. Pop pop. The strobe lights made targeting a nightmare. The enemies appeared to teleport in the darkness between flashes. I fumbled for a flash bang on my belt, ripped the pin, and bolted toward the cluster of monstrosities rushing the stairs. I squeezed my eyes shut and turned away. The detonation was a physical punch, the overpressure wave rattling my teeth. When I looked back, 3 of them were down, convulsing, their sensory organs overloaded. but more were pouring from the vents, dripping that same black ichor. I hit the corridor, grabbing the heavy iron wheel of the blast door to spin it shut. A hand, pale, wet, and far too long, shot through the narrowing gap, grasping at my vest. The grip was like hydraulic pincers. I drew my sidearm, a SIG P226, and fired 3 rounds point blank into the limb. It disintegrated into black sludge, and I slammed the door home, spinning the wheel until the locking bars engaged. A heavy thud shook the door. Then another. They were throwing themselves against the steel. I turned to run, but the corridor was different now. The water was rising faster. The structural charges I'd said earlier? They hadn't just weakened the integrity. They had ruptured the outer hull. The ocean was reclaiming the base. I was trapped between a legion of biological horrors and the crushing depth of the Pacific. I checked the map on my forearm case. There was one route left. The ventilation shaft in the auxiliary pump room, 40 meters back the way I came, through the flooded section. I waded forward, the water now at chest level. The cold was biting, sapping my core temperature. Every movement was a struggle against the viscosity of the fluid. Suddenly, the facility's PA system crackled to life, powered by some dying reserve battery. A voice, distorted and looping, echoed through the drowning hallway. It wasn't Japanese. It was a recording of my own voice, from my radio check 3 hours ago. Anyone reading this? Sector 4. The creatures weren't just aggressive, they were mimicking me. They were learning. I reached the pump room. The water was near the ceiling here. I had to go submerged. I took 3 rapid, hyperventilating breaths to saturate my blood with oxygen, clipped the regulator of my emergency pony bottle into my mouth, and clicked on my weapon light. I submerged. The world turned into a murky green blur. Debris floated past, papers, chairs, a human boot with the foot still inside. I kicked toward the vent grate on the far wall. It was screwed shut. I pulled my knife, a fixed-blade K-bar, and jammed it into the mesh, prying with desperate strength. My lungs burned. The cold pressed against my eyes. Behind me, through the murky water, I saw shapes diving in. They could swim. And they were fast. The grate gave way with a silent tearing of metal. I squeezed into the shaft, kicking off the wall, propelling myself upward into the tight, claustrophobic darkness of the vent. Something grabbed my ankle. A vice-like grip. I thrashed, kicking wildly, my boot connecting with something soft. The grip loosened. I scrambled up, elbows and knees scraping against the galvanized steel, surfacing into an air pocket halfway up the shaft. I gasped, spitting out the regulator. I was in the service climbway, a vertical chute with a rusted ladder leading to the surface jungle. But beneath me, the water in the shaft was churning. They were coming up. I looked up at the circle of faint moonlight far above, the exit. Then I looked at the satchel charge remaining on my belt. 1 block of C4. If I blew the shaft below me, I'd seal them in, but the shockwave in this confined space might liquefy my organs. Protocol Black, I muttered, my hand shaking as I primed the detonator. Burial at land. I pulled the pin, dropped the charge down the watery hole, and began to climb. I had 10 seconds to outrun the blast. The concussive thrum of the shaped charges I'd planted on the generator bulkheads vibrated through the soles of my boots. A rhythmic shudder that dislodged 70 years of rust from the ceiling pipes. I checked my Sunto core. 2 minutes until the structural supports of Sector 4 gave way. The facility wasn't just collapsing, it was being erased, a contingency I had initiated but was now racing to survive. The readout on the handheld thermal imager clipped to my vest was a chaotic wash of white-hot interference. The geothermal vents below the base wreaking havoc on the sensors. But I could still make out the 3 distinct heat signatures closing in from the eastern corridor. The cleaners. They moved with the fluid, predatory grace of Tier 1 operators, their gear devoid of insignias. Their faces obscured by ballistic masks that looked like obsidian skulls in the flickering halogen strobe of the emergency lighting. I pressed my back against the cold, sweating concrete of the junction, sliding a fresh magazine into the mag well of the scavenged Type 89 rifle. It was heavy, archaic, but the 5.56mm rounds would still tear through Kevlar at this range. I didn't have the luxury of stealth anymore. Protocol Black wasn't just a file or a cache of Imperial gold. I realized that as I'd passed through the biocontainment wing moments ago. The cylinders hadn't been empty. They were filled with a viscous, light-absorbing fluid that seemed to ripple in response to my proximity, a biological computational substrate. Developed in 1944 but maintained by modern technology. The Japanese Navy hadn't abandoned this base. They had been evicted by something they created. Something that had been patiently waiting in the dark for decades, and these mercenaries weren't here to loot it. They were here to feed it. Target is cornered in sublevel 3. A voice crackled over the captured radio frequency, distorted by encryption but chillingly calm. Initiate containment. Sterilize the witness. I pulled the pin on my last M67 fragmentation grenade, holding the spoon tight. The tactical disadvantage was severe, a dead end behind me, 3 hostiles ahead, and the ocean pressing against the hull plates of the submarine pen below. I needed a vertical escape. I rolled the grenade around the corner, counting the bounce, 1, 2, before the detonation thundered through the confined space. Followed instantly by screams and the wet slap of shrapnel hitting meat. I didn't wait for the dust to settle. I swung out, rifle raised, double-tapping the silhouette staggering in the smoke before sprinting toward the ventilation maintenance hatch on the far wall. The hatch was seized by corrosion. I slammed the rifle stock against the locking mechanism, adrenaline overriding the pain in my fractured ribs. The metal shrieked, giving way just as bullets sparked against the bulkhead inches from my head. I hauled myself into the shaft, the darkness absolute, smelling of mold and old secrets. Below me, the voices regrouped, professional and angry. I began the climb, the rungs slick with condensation, my muscles screaming with every pull. The shaft was a vertical lung for the facility, exhaling the stale air of the grave up toward the jungle's surface. But as I climbed, I saw it, faint, phosphorescent veins running along the interior cabling. The fungal-like spread of Protocol Black had breached containment long ago. It was in the walls. It was in the wiring. The base wasn't just housing the experiment, the base was the experiment. I reached the upper grate, kicking it open and spilling out onto the moss-covered concrete of the surface perimeter. The transition was a physical blow. The cool, recycled air of the underground was instantly replaced by the suffocating humidity of the Philippine jungle. The cacophony of insects was deafening, a stark contrast to the mechanical hum below. I scrambled into the dense foliage, the massive fern fronds whipping my face, just as the ground beneath me lurched. The charges. A low, grinding groan echoed from the earth, like a dying titan, as the subterranean caverns imploded. The sinkhole where I had entered days ago collapsed inward, swallowing the entrance, the rusty cranes, and the mercenaries still trapped in the ascent shaft. I didn't stop running until I reached the extraction point, a rocky outcrop overlooking the cove. The sun was setting, bleeding crimson across the horizon, painting the jungle in violent hues. I collapsed against the roots of a banyan tree, chest heaving, checking my gear. The waterproof drive containing the photos of the tanks, the schematics of the biological neural net, and the decrypted comms logs was safe in my chest pocket. It felt heavy, heavier than the gold would have been. I pulled out the satellite phone, extending the antenna. No signal. I moved higher, climbing the rock face until the display flickered with a single bar of strength. As I dialed the emergency contact, I looked down at my hand. A thin, black vein was pulsing under the skin of my wrist, right where I had cut myself on the containment valve in the lab. It wasn't an infection. It moved with a deliberate, rhythmic purpose, syncing with my heartbeat. Protocol Black wasn't designed to stay in the tanks. It was designed to find a host. The tactical reality shifted instantly. I wasn't just a survivor carrying evidence anymore. I was the carrier. The line connected. Status? The handler's voice asked, distant and metallic. I looked at the black vein inching toward my palm. Then back at the collapsed ruin of the naval base where the smoke was beginning to curl up through the canopy. The mercenaries were buried, but the secret was out. I realized why the cleaners wore full hazmat seals under their tactical vests. They knew. And now, whoever sent me here would know that I knew. Base is destroyed, I said, my voice raspy, hiding the tremor. Hostiles neutralized. No intel recovered. Mission failed. Copy that. Proceed to secondary extraction. We'll debrief in Manila. I ended the call and crushed the phone under my boot, shattering the SIM card and the GPS locator. I couldn't go back. Not with this inside me. Not with the truth of what the Imperial Navy had left behind, and what the modern syndicates were trying to wake up. The jungle was vast, a green hell of unmapped terrain and forgotten ghosts. It was the only place left to hide. I checked the chamber of my rifle, 12 rounds left. I stood up, turning my back on the ocean, and walked deeper into the tree line. The survival mission hadn't ended, it had just evolved. Protocol Black was active, and I was Patient Zero.